Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and its tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And my name is Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed Navy videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that the government has admitted that UFOs are real,
Or at least that the videos were authentic.
it raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
Right? They may still be unlikely. But there's so many explanations for these stories. Even if the truth is more mundane than you're hoping, if any of it turns out to be true, whew,
Woo! It's a very exciting time. Oh, man. So Annie pointed something out to me about our
hmm,
intro that I thought was worth
yeah.
mentioning. She was like, "Do people know what the phenomenon is?" And I think
I
you
said that
asked the
too.
same thing. Yeah, okay. So I stand by, I think that the intro explains it. But in case anyone is listening, has any questions, the phenomenon is a blanket term that people in ufology, a word that makes Chuck giggle every time,
Every time.
people in ufology use to cover the entire thing, everything about
Yeah.
UFOs, secret military programs, abductions, cattle mutilation. Like, if you can think of it, if it is at all related to UFOs, it falls under the blanket heading the phenomenon.
The
And
phenomenon.
I think the reason people like that term is because it kind of avoids ascribing anything to it other than something is happening. So we're studying the phenomena. We're not studying aliens. We're not, alien
Sure.
enthusiasts. We're not ancient alien theorists. We're studying the phenomenon. The phenomenon may turn
Yeah.
out to be a Black Ops jet program, and there's nothing
Who
to it.
knows?
The
Who knows?
phenomenon may
Yeah.
turn out to be Chinese drones. It may turn out to be gray aliens from Zeta Reticuli. You never know. So
Who
anyway,
knows?
that's the
The
phenomenon.
So the other reason I giggle, one of my old radio stations that I listened to used to play a song that was like Phenomena, but it was Phenomena, da, 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 Phenomena, da, 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 da.
It's hilarious. We
I
should
don't
see if
know.
we can
That
license it. It could be our
that
theme
perks up.
song.
Yeah, right. I don't know. That's short enough. Maybe it's fair use.
All right. So today, I'm going to be honest with you, podcast listeners. We kind of expected to be recording a different episode. Uh, the 2022 UAP Task Force report
Mhm.
was due out
Very
on
exciting.
Halloween, 2 weeks ago, as of our recording. Uh,
Which is a perfect day,
it's
right?
Yeah, it would have
Like,
been
did they
great.
choose that day on purpose?
I have no idea. Like, they gave them a
That'd be pretty
deadline. It
awesome.
happened to fall on Halloween. Anyway,
Happened to, yeah.
the
Now
the
I'm
report is
already in
not out.
conspiracy mode.
But yeah, the report is not out, and I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
UFO Reddit, as you can imagine, is a swirling morass of conspiracy theories at the moment.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Checks
and
out.
a lot of people are like, how could they just not deliver it? And then a lot of people are
It's
coming in and
weird.
trying to sound all
Is that
knowledgeable
allowed?
about the government, like, oh, whatever, the government never does anything on that. I don't know the answer. I'm not in the
Okay.
military
Yeah.
nor the government. I don't know how big a deal it is when a department is obligated to make a report by a certain date and they just completely miss it. I
Hmm.
don't know.
I suppose
There
it's like
was,
software. It's probably not great, but you
yeah,
know,
yeah,
shit happens.
exactly. So there was a little bit of speculation in the community. There was a single UFO Twitter account that claimed to have seen a draft version of it, and they were
Hmm.
saying that it's going to be a big nothing burger. They're going to say that
Hmm.
all UFOs are Chinese
Hmm.
drones. I don't know.
Okay.
I
Well,
don't
we'll
really
see.
want to get caught up in speculation, but figured it was worth addressing. If anybody is listening to these as they come out, uh, we are expecting to do an episode very soon on the 2022 UFO report, but it's past
Okay.
due. So instead, today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite bits of highly controversial UFO lore.
Oh,
We're
good.
going to be talking about Bob Lazar and Area 51.
Okay, and
Now,
it's
before I
pronounced
dive into this,
Lazar, not like
yeah,
laser or something.
yeah, you'd probably like it to be pronounced laser. Before we dive into this, Chuck, what have you heard about Area 51? Because Area 51 is in
Okay,
pop culture, right? Like it's part of the
yeah.
culture. So even if you're not familiar with Bob Lazar, I suspect you have heard of Area 51.
Yes, but I know shockingly little about it, if I'm honest. And I've never heard of Bob Laser. But all I all I know about Area 51, I think it's in like Nevada,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
supposed to be like very secure, but what military
Hmm.
base isn't? Um, and in I think that there was supposed to be like alien craft there or
Hmm.
something, but that's like even that
Nope,
feels
you got
hazy
it
to
in
me.
one.
All
You
right,
got it in
great.
one. There's two
Woohoo.
parts to this. First of all, Area 51 is a legit secretive military base out in the Nevada test range. The
Okay.
Nevada test range is kind of an umbrella term for a massive hunk of Nevada that is
Mm,
owned by the federal government and is used for bombing and testing. Nuclear tests were done out there, chemical
okay.
weapon tests have been done out there. They've got big areas where planes can practice bombing runs, anything you can think of.
Okay.
Most notably, Area 51, which goes by a bunch of names, Dreamland, The Ranch, places like that, is
Dreamland. That's cool.
a aircraft testing facility. So
Okay.
um, the U-2 bomber was developed and tested
Mm,
there. The
nice.
the Blackbird, the really cool one that you always see in the X-Men
Yep.
movies,
Okay.
SR-71 was
Yeah, yeah.
developed and tested there. And most
So fun.
recently, the F-1117, the Nighthawk, the one that looks like
Hmm.
it's all angles, that one was developed
Yeah.
and tested there.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
for
Okay.
something like
So,
30 years, there's been secretive airplane testing going on there. So as you can
right.
imagine, one of the common UFO debunking tactics is anybody who sees a UFO
Yeah.
within a state of
Right.
Nevada, it was probably a test flight. And they're not wrong. Certainly,
Yeah.
these planes would have triggered a lot of UFO reports. They fly
Yeah.
unusually, they look unusual, they fly outside of the
Yeah.
normal range of aircraft.
The U2
You can
especially.
imagine. Yeah, totally.
So is it an accident that you chose three aircraft that are extreme high altitude, or is that like also a thing? Like the U2
Uh,
is
the
like still
three I
to this
picked were
day, I
just
think.
the three that I know of.
Okay, all right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think the U2
So
is to this day
maybe.
still the highest altitude airplane we use. We don't use it terribly often, but um,
Yeah, I don't know. Uh,
it's a wild
but the
aircraft.
point is, it's a legitimate facility. It was not
Yeah.
acknowledged by
Okay.
the government until like the 90s or the 2000s.
Yeah.
It didn't appear on maps. There's a whole lot about it that I don't really want to
I
get
bet it
into.
does now. Wait, can
The
we find it
second
on Google
part,
Maps?
yeah, I think
You don't think it's like blurred out or like censored? I don't know if they
I'll
can
be
do
honest
that.
with you, I haven't tried.
We should
I
do that.
suspect you will be able to see an airfield and a military structure.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Interestingly, UFO Reddit, which I was on this morning trying to see if the UFO report had come out,
Yeah.
is currently on fire because a guy that operates a website about Area 51 was just raided by the FBI. So they're trying to figure out
Oh,
what he had that the
yeah.
FBI was raiding him for. Like he got
Sure.
new photos of Area 51 and what's in them, you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the
It.
second part
But
of
we
Area
all. It's
51.
not going to be something fun. It's going to be
Yeah,
something
you're right, right.
terrible and
Yeah.
like. Yeah.
So the second part of Area 51 that everyone kind of vaguely understands is something about aliens, right? Don't they have
Okay. Yeah.
aliens there? Isn't that where they have the UFOs? Like
Yeah.
it's something that we all are kind of vaguely aware of. So in terms of the rumor mill, we talked briefly about Roswell and stuff like that. There have always been rumors that when the military does crash recovery, they would take the recovered vehicles to certain Air Force bases.
Sure.
Wright Patterson is one of the ones that's always in there. The other one is Area 51, big secretive
Yeah.
test range in the middle of Nevada, good security. It makes sense.
Good, safe place to
Um,
do it if you've already got all the like stealth protocols set up and everything. Yeah.
yeah. So there were already vague rumors that
Yeah. Okay.
in the secretive military facility in the Nevada test range that the government won't admit exists, but everyone knows exists because the people who live around there are aware of it,
Uh,
that was where they kept the UFOs. This all
okay.
got a real kick in the pants in the 80s when a guy named Bob Lazar came out and claimed to have worked at Area 51 reverse engineering UFOs.
Okay. Perfect. I'm,
All right.
yeah.
So
I mean,
there's a
sorry.
little
I mean,
footnote here.
okay. Carry on.
Bob says he didn't actually work at Area 51.
Oh,
Area
okay.
51 is kind of like the official facility where they do the airplane testing. He worked at a sub facility because the whole area
Ah,
is so big. There are many, many facilities. He worked at an area called S4. So Area 51 is on Groom Lake. Area S4 is 10, 15 miles south at an area called Papoose Lake. So it's supposed to
papoose.
be a different facility, much more secretive. Bob describes like
Ooh.
when you roll up to it, there are these hangars that are built into the side of the mountain, and the hangar bay doors are designed to look like rocks. So when they're closed, you can't really see
Ah,
anything.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you can totally see it on Google Maps. I'm sorry, that's what I've been
no, that's fine.
doing this
Yeah.
whole time.
So,
It's fascinating, like high detail and everything. Like
uh-huh.
it's really interesting. Um, yeah, and I don't know if it has S4 on here, but
I
anyways,
suspect it doesn't. But if you scroll down to Papoose Lake, see if you see any secret hatchways inside of the mountain.
okay, I'll
Um,
check it out. Maybe after the
so
podcast.
Area 51 has been confirmed. It is a
Okay,
real place. It exists. It is
sure.
still tightly controlled, but
Yeah.
like we know for a fact it exists. Area S4 is still theoretical. A lot of people think it does exist. There are other people who have come out who claim to have worked at S4. They do or
Hmm.
do not confirm the UFO parts of it, but like it is 100% believable that there are multiple facilities in this
Yeah.
large region. And if you think about the way that compartmentalization works, and if there was a UFO reverse engineering program, you can understand they probably wouldn't keep that at the main facility where the regular test pilots are. You'd keep it at the sub facility a ways away. So it is known in the area that if you're flying into Area 51, because nobody lives on the base, or if they do, not a lot of people do. Most people
Yeah.
live nearby in Vegas and they take what's called a Janet flight. I don't know what Janet is an acronym for, but they
Huh.
come into a particular airfield around there. They hop on a jet that flies them into Groom Lake. Bob says that when
Okay.
he got off in Groom Lake, he would hang out in a cafeteria in the Area 51 facility waiting for his ride, which was a bus with blacked out windows that would take him and anybody else down to S4.
Huh. Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
so that's kind of the meat of what's going on with Area 51. Before I dive into Bob's
Yeah.
story, you got any questions about
Yeah.
like the facility, kind of what's going on there?
Have you ever been to a military facility or been on base?
No.
Okay. Um, it's it's probably exactly what you think, but there's some fascinating stuff around it that I won't go into. But it this all feels very reasonable to me from my experience, like
Hmm.
getting onto base with my brother or
Oh,
surrogate
totally.
brother,
Yeah.
and like the idea of actually, uh, other times I've been on base on more like public bases. In Hawaii, they
Hmm.
have bases you can go to that have like actual stores in there, and you still have to
Hmm.
check
Yeah.
in with the MP at the
Right.
front gate. But it's more like just a gated community. But I could totally imagine
No, totally. Fort
if
Lewis
you're
in
not on the
Washington
guest
is like
list.
that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, makes sense to me that yeah, all of that feels very believable. So
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So nothing so far is setting up red flags. So The
Yeah.
next part is what's going to send up the red flags.
Okay.
So,
Cool.
brief bit of backstory here. Bob says he worked as a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory in 1982. He was in
Okay.
his early 20s. He attended a lecture by Dr. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb.
Hmm.
And he says he was really excited to see him speak. And when he walked up, he found him standing outside, like reading the newspaper, waiting to start his lecture. And coincidentally, Bob was on the front page of the paper at the time. They're in this, small town in Los Alamos,
Yeah.
and he was on the front paper because he had a jet car. He had literally built a jet engine into a
Well,
Honda, and this is what he
okay.
drove to work every day.
Because
So,
that's what you do
fun,
with a Honda.
yeah, fun
Yeah.
front page story. He's like, everybody in Los Alamos knew me. I'm the jet car guy. So here he is
Okay.
on the front page of the paper. Los Alamos National Laboratory physicist Bob Lazar drives a jet car to work. So, he walks
Yeah.
up to Ed
Right.
Teller
Right.
with a
So,
perfect intro. He's like,
um,
hey, that's me.
when when was the Manhattan Project? Because that was also at Los Alamos, right? Or was that a different facility?
Yeah. So that was in the 40s,
40s. Okay. So this is like
World
40
War II.
years separate, and like Dr. Teller is from the 40s or whatever, and
Mhm.
now this new young pup
Well,
in his
hydrogen
jet
bombs
car.
were later, but yes.
Okay. All right. Cool. Cool. I didn't have the timeline. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, he comes up, he sees Dr. Teller, he's like, oh man, what a perfect opportunity. So he introduces himself, you
Yeah.
know, walks in, attends the lecture, everything's fine. Cut to a few years later. Bob has moved away from Los Alamos. He is in Las Vegas. He is looking for work as a physicist. He
Okay.
was trying to
Yeah.
get out of military programs and stuff. So he claimed. I want to be
I
clear.
know.
This part
I'll
of the
go to
story
Area
is a little
51.
hazy. Well, so here's the thing. One of the things I actually appreciate about Bob is when he tells the story the way you and I would talk about our employment history, right? If you were to
Yeah.
ask me, like, Scott, under exactly what circumstances did you join the company Metal Toad where you worked with Chuck 12 years ago? I'd be like,
It's like I don't know.
well, that was after this other job. Like, and I've got this stuff written down. Like, Bob's just doing it from memory. So
Somewhere. Yeah.
Bob is a little hazy about some of the details,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
the
Makes
way
sense.
Bob remembers it, he was trying to get out of the type of work he was doing at Los Alamos National Labs and just do like more straight physics. Um,
Hmm.
he remembered Dr. Teller, figured shoot for the moon. He
Yeah.
writes to him, says, hey, I don't know if you remember me. We met outside the lecture. I was the guy with the jet car. Dr. Teller totally remembers him and gives him a reference to the company
Oh,
EG
cool.
and G. Now,
Okay.
if those initials sound
Does that
familiar,
stand for?
I don't actually know what it stands for, but they are a government
Okay.
like military contractor. But
Okay. All
if
right.
they sound familiar, it's because you saw those letters in the Admiral Wilson document that we talked about. Their
Oh.
conversation was in the parking lot at the EG&G building in Las Vegas.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
So Bob gets a
insert
reference
pun
to
about
apply.
chicken and egg. So
Yeah.
we can move on.
So Bob gets a reference to apply at EG&G.
Okay.
Long story short, this turns into work at a
Yeah.
secure government facility. That's pretty much all they tell him. Uh,
Yeah.
he shows up. He takes the Janet flight out to Area 51.
Hmm.
Um,
It's like,
so
oh,
he ends up
interesting.
working at S4 in Area 51 starting in December of '88. Bob talks about like his first day, they give him all these briefing documents, like 2-page summaries of all the science projects that are happening here. So here's
Hmm.
Project X, which is
That's
doing
cool.
this. Here's Project B.
Yeah.
And the idea is you're only going to be on this one. These programs are highly compartmentalized, but
Okay.
all of these programs, according to Bob, were working on reverse engineering aspects of a UFO. So it was valuable for him to have at least a broad understanding of there's another team working on the view
Okay.
screen, and there's another team working on
Sure.
the metal panels, and yada yada.
Okay. Yeah, makes
The
sense.
project that Bob joins is reverse engineering the flight and propulsion system. which is an
Shit.
antimatter reactor. Uh, he says he was working with a guy named Barry. He said Barry was extremely excited to have a lab partner again. He
I
says,
bet.
I never got the full details, but the story, as I heard it, was Barry's previous lab partner was killed in an accident when they tried to cut open one of the reactors.
Oh God. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
so they could use an adult in the room then, it sounds like.
Well, I'm not sure Bob's the guy, but yes.
Oh, okay.
But
Great. Okay.
the main thing to take away is he says we work on the buddy system because
Okay.
this stuff is so sensitive, so compartmentalized. Literally, the
Yeah.
only person you are allowed to talk to about your project is your buddy. So Barry has
Sure.
been working alone for a while. You get the impression
Yeah.
he's a little off. So he is
Yeah.
extremely excited to have another person in the lab and finally be able to talk to someone. Um,
Right. Yeah.
so there are
I get
other
that.
two-man groups. Bob mentioned there are like 22 people in total working on this.
Hmm.
Um, he gets a little hand wavy about it, but he's very clear that security is extremely tight. At one
Yeah.
point,
Makes sense.
George Knapp, who's the journalist who interviews him later, mentions he's like, "So what? Like they held guns to your head?" He's like, "Everything short of. I mean, they're like poking their finger in my chest, screaming at me. Like the whole
Hmm.
thing is very intense and intimidating. It was not a fun place
Interesting.
to work." Um,
Yeah.
uh, at one point
Yeah.
they're asking him like, well, how do you report your progress? He's like, there's a guy named Dennis who would come by and just check in with us. He would just ask for status reports. I assume
Hmm.
Dennis is the guy who is cleared to collect information from all of them and report it upstream. He's like, but I don't know. I don't know who he was reporting to. I don't know how.
Hmm.
We didn't like write reports. We just told Dennis what we were doing. Um,
Okay. Interesting.
Now, the engine that they're working with is fascinating. So he describes this as being a hemisphere over a chunk of an element, which we'll talk about in a minute, that
Okay.
when it was excited, turns into an antimatter reaction, produces an antimatter reaction. And the
Okay.
device turns that into gravity waves. It is emitting gravity waves.
Okay.
Something that's worth noting here is in the 80s, when Bob came out with this story, the leading theory for what caused gravity was a particle called a graviton. That has since
Hmm.
been disproved, but gravity waves were first detected in the
Yep.
early 2000s. Like, that's a relatively new thing. Now, it was theorized before. The theory of general relativity calls for gravity waves, but it
Yep.
wasn't proven until then. So here's Bob back in the 80s saying, we had a device that generates gravity. And one funny thing
Gravity
about
or
Bob,
gravity waves?
gravity waves, but I mean,
Okay.
there isn't really a difference between those two. Um, One funny thing about Bob is when he tells this stories, he is all about the science. Like he will talk for hours about the element that powered it and how the engine worked and like the anti-gravity and all this stuff, and then someone will ask him about like security protocols. He'll be like, I don't know, like yeah, there were guys with guns there. Like, it's
Yeah.
so clear, like his attention
It's
was
not the
very
interesting part.
focused. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Um, so one of the things Bob describes is Barry gets really excited. He turns on the reactor. He says, come over here and try to touch it. So Bob comes over and tries to touch it. And as his hand approaches, he's encountering resistance. He says it feels exactly like when you try to
Hmm.
touch two magnets together on the same pole, except it was
Interesting.
affecting his hand,
Sure.
which obviously magnetic waves do not do that. So very interesting. He's like, this is effectively a gravity generating machine. Uh, at various times, he was allowed to see the craft that it came out of. He got to walk past it
Hmm.
once. He got to see it flying once, like a simple like fly it back and forth and settle it down test. And he
Okay.
got to go inside it once. Now, each time he was allowed to see it, it was on the understanding that it is possible that seeing the thing in its hole will unlock something. But it is very clear that like
Sure.
he is escorted by guards. Everybody's
Yeah.
extremely nervous about this.
Hmm.
When he describes going inside the craft, he says the whole thing is maybe 50 feet wide. The only thing that was recognizably human was there was this weird, not recognizably human, but something that we could make was there was this weird kind of
Okay.
collapsible honeycomb hatchway. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, I know how to make that. Everything else in it was unfathomable.
Okay.
Everything looks like it was poured out of a liquid metal. Everything is a
Mm,
curved, round surface.
sure.
The main area is uncomfortable for humans. It was based on
Okay.
the size of the chairs. He says he's guessing the people who were meant to operate this craft were around 3 feet tall. So
Very convenient.
in the main area, there's a spot for the reactor. Then there are three chairs arranged around it in a triangle. There are no control surfaces, no screens. There's a second level up above. He could poke his head up and see. He wasn't sure what it was. He's guessing maybe a navigational computer or something. And if you
Hmm.
stuck your head through a hatch and looked down below, there was a sub level where there were what he described as three garbage cans on pivots. So these three rotating things. And he found out those are the beam emitters. So the thing is
Okay.
designed to take the gravity waves that the reactor generates and channel them out through these three emitters, which by
Okay.
pivoting them around, you can control where the craft goes.
Three is an interesting number
It is.
because um, while technically possible to like hover in one direction, we generally accept, I don't know, in aerospace, it's generally accepted that
Mhm.
that is not enough
Yeah,
degrees of freedom to actually operate.
totally.
So three
Well,
feels very suspicious.
Bob is very clear. Every time he talks about this craft, he's like, nothing about this makes sense.
All
Every
right, yeah,
single
fair.
thing about this craft violates everything we know
Hmm,
about physics. He's like, I
yeah,
got to see it working. He's like, one of the things that I saw happening was they were talking to the guy with a regular like VHF radio. It's like that doesn't make any sense. The thing is flying by gravity waves. Gravity waves distort light. Those
hmm,
radio waves would just wrap around the craft and keep going. I could hear
yeah,
them talking to the guy. They've clearly found a way to, but nothing about this makes sense. Like he
yeah,
is very clear. He's like, I'm not trying to claim I know how we did it. And he's also very clear that they didn't make very much progress. He's
yeah.
like, Barry and I, like, we didn't know what to do. Like, the fact that Barry's previous lab partner died from them trying to crack one of these engines open, that's not a move that you do when you feel like you understand what's going on. That's a move of
Right.
desperation, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
He's made the
Yeah.
analogy frequently that them having access to this engine would be like us dropping a functional nuclear reactor off to a Victorian scientist.
Yeah.
Like,
It would make no goddamn
they're
sense.
it's going to make no goddamn sense and it's going to kill them, right? Like at
Yeah.
one point they're going
Yeah.
to open something and flood the room with lethal radiation. Everyone will die. And not only will
And they
everyone
won't
die,
even know
but
why.
everyone who comes to check on them will die. Like it'll
Yeah.
just,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So he's
They'll
like,
have
this is
no
the
idea
level,
why. They'll die
right?
years later, maybe, or maybe right then. It's
Exactly.
like, yeah.
Yeah.
Woof.
So he's very clear, like, this was not something where we are like, oh yeah, we get this. Like our task is to reverse engineer and hopefully reproduce it. But like we were just in the like measuring things. Like how strong are
Hmm.
the gravity waves? How far out do they affect? What could we do to affect the strength of the gravity waves?
Sure.
Um,
Can we direct
he
it with buckets? Or are these special
right,
buckets?
yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
he says that the reactor was powered by an element called element 115. He says at the time they called it unpentium. Element
Okay.
115 is now on the periodic table. In the 80s, it was not. It is now called
Sure.
moscovium. It has been synthesized two or three times. It is
Yeah.
extremely radioactive and has a half life of seconds. It
Hmm.
is just extremely unstable.
Yeah.
You would think element 115 being successfully synthesized would prove Bob's story, but in fact, everybody's like, well, this debunks his story because
Yeah.
he says it was stable and it's not. And Bob's like, Jesus Christ, like it was an isotope, obviously. He's like, fucking helium
Obviously.
has isotopes, some of which are radioactive and some of which aren't. All this proves is we haven't
Yeah.
made a stable isotope yet. Take from it what you
Hmm.
will. But in the
Yeah.
80s, Bob said they were working with an unknown element called element 115. That element has since been synthesized, although it is not stable as he described. Now, Bob has
Yeah.
all sorts of descriptions about how the stable form of this element worked. It was like it had to be made in a very particular way, synthesized, and then you shaved it down into a cone, and then you cut off cross sections of the cone, and
Hmm.
and he makes it very clear they were not producing this. Nobody in the U.S. military knew how to produce it. All the 115 they had came with the engine.
Yeah. So
So do
I'm looking
do with
at
that what you will.
yeah, I'm looking. This is actually a really cool graph on the actual element 115, and they've got this graph of number of protons versus number of neutrons, and how stable they expect that element would be. And there are some that are actually
Right.
completely stable over a year. Um,
Hmm.
Actually, there's quite a few, which is sort of
Right.
wild. I, I don't
But
know anything about.
this
Yeah,
gets into one of the things that people do find suspicious about Bob Lazar. He is
yeah,
clearly a knowledgeable scientist, regardless
sure,
of whatever else you think about him. A knowledgeable scientist is capable of reading the theoretical elements that we think will exist on the periodic table and
right,
talking about them. So
yeah,
it's not
and
necessarily proof that Bob came up with a clever one, but it does bear out. He said element 115 exists. It now does exist. You know,
and it could have been just that 114 was the previous one, right? And he didn't
yeah.
know what it
I,
was.
I think it
Let's
was a
call it
couple of
115
that,
for
but
now.
yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So Bob talks a lot about the antimatter engine that they were working on. He says the
yeah,
whole thing was wireless. There were no conduits connecting it to any of the parts, so very
okay,
reminiscent of Nikola Tesla. He was able to describe the kind of heart-shaped field that is emitted around the craft. He describes how the craft would fly, which is
hmm.
it would it may come in for a landing flat
Hmm.
and hover the way you would expect, but when it lifts up, it would rotate up on its belly because it's going to fly belly first because of where those emitters
What?
are.
Oh, interesting. Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Now, weirdly, this aligns with one of those Navy videos that was released in the
Oh,
2017 article. The
well,
one
that's
called
exciting.
Gimbal very clearly shows the object rotating and accelerating. Do with that
Okay.
what you will, but
Yeah, so so
another
is
little
the
element like
yeah, is the idea that that these bucket beamformers or whatever can push or pull? Is that kind of the idea?
as I understand it, and I probably don't understand it.
And let's be realistic. Okay, go on.
uh, they are changing the gravity in the craft to make it so that the craft is falling towards something, and you can
Okay.
change the
Yeah,
target
yeah.
that it is falling towards. So if you point all the
Interesting.
beam emitters at the same point, you get a very strong pull. If you point them away, you get a lower pull. Um, since it can hover, you can imagine that it can, I don't know if it's attracting itself to a point just off the ground or if it is repelling itself from the ground. So I don't know
Yeah.
the answer to your question, but he describes all three of those trash cans as being on gimbals and being able to kind of rotate around independently. So
Yeah.
obviously they can't go 360 because they're in the bottom half of the craft, but they can pivot and steer to help direct the gravity waves to
Yeah.
move the craft.
This is interesting. So I was checking to see when Alcubierre described his warp drive, because it sounds a little bit like that. But
Yeah,
Alcubierre didn't uh, describe this until 1994. So
yeah.
we're 14 years too early for
Hmm.
Lazar to be like just reading sci-fi,
No,
um,
totally. And
which is
also
interesting.
this whole idea of how these craft could work. is one of the things that people tend to come up with. Like if you work backwards from what we see UFOs do, which is
Mm,
hypersonic flight without acceleration, without G forces on the craft,
yeah.
instantaneous turns, transmedium travels. A lot of that stuff is explained by the craft having a pocket around it that means
Yeah.
it isn't affected by the air around it,
Yeah.
that it isn't
Yeah.
affected by the water when it goes into the water. Like it's able to
Yeah.
slice through things because the way that it is moving is dealing with that for it. I don't even
Yeah. And
pretend to
that's
be a scientist, so I am repeating
yeah.
things that I have heard third and
No,
fourth
no.
hand. I'm sure someone out there is screaming, but
Yeah.
that's my understanding of
Probably
this.
right. But I mean, that's actually kind of my understanding of the Alcubierre drive as well. That
Hmm.
one of the challenges with it is that you continue at the velocity that you are currently going.
Hmm.
You go to a different place, but you still have the same velocity you were going. And um, so when people talk about this as a means of space travel, one of the challenges is that you still have to have some way of uh, getting more velocity locally without folding
Right.
space-time.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, and there's some thoughts about how that could be done, but it wouldn't. It seems like it wouldn't allow if this was an Alcubierre drive. It seems like it wouldn't allow hovering per se, unless it was just like
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But
I don't know.
sure, yeah. I mean,
All right. So I want to keep
interesting that
going
this
because we're
stuff came out
almost done
later.
with this
Yeah,
section. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. Keep going.
like I said, most of the time Bob is only allowed into the office to talk to Barry, but a couple of times he's allowed to see the craft. One of the times that he saw the craft, he said there are these hangars built into the side of the mountain with these camouflaged bay opening doors, but all of the bays inside all have hangar doors, bay doors between them. And one time when he
Hmm.
went in, all of the bay doors were open, and he was able to see
Okay.
all up and down the length of it. He says there are 9 UFOs in
Hmm.
S4. They're all different.
Hmm.
So he was working on one he calls the sports model, which I think is just like an internal nickname. Um,
Okay.
he described some of the different ones, but he's very clear that they are all very different. One of them he describes is up on its side and has a hole punched through it. He's like, that's the only
Hmm.
one that looks like maybe it was shot down or took any
Hmm.
damage. All the rest are intact.
Okay.
He mentions hearing a rumor that one of the craft was recovered via archaeological means, which is a
Okay.
fascinating little
Cool.
throwaway
Yeah.
detail.
Interesting. Like, yeah. How did he know? But I guess I don't know. Cool.
Well, so he's very clear, like, you're
Yeah.
not
He only heard
supposed to
it.
talk, but also people
Yeah.
do talk, or you walk past
Yeah.
someone and you hear things you weren't supposed to. He's said some
Yeah.
other things too that I'm not really getting into. But yeah, basically, he is on site working in this fascinating place doing this weird stuff. He is working part time, which means they would call him up at odd hours. He's like, I would get a phone call at 11 o'clock. They're like, it's 11 o'clock now. You need to be at this airfield at
Hmm.
11:45, and we're going to fly you into Groom Lake. Um, this would happen all the time. Because the program is so secret, you're sworn to secrecy, not only to not tell anybody, but like you're not supposed to tell your family, including
Hmm.
pointedly his spouse. He was married at the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh, because he didn't tell his spouse, he says, and this he found this out later, his wife thought he was cheating on him, so
Hmm.
she started cheating on him with her flight instructor.
Yeah.
Bob didn't know
Sure.
this. He had no idea. But they're surveilling him, so they knew his wife was
Hmm.
cheating on him. So they start paying a lot more attention to Bob because they're
Yeah.
worried.
I
This
bet.
is the kind of thing that makes you a security risk.
Yeah. Right.
It was a little unclear whether they said something to him at work or not, but Bob got the impression that he was like they were suspicious of him or that he might not be long for the program. He got
Okay.
nervous. He goes, there's no way they're going to let me just go get another job as a physicist with what I know. Like, this isn't the kind of job you
Interesting.
just get fired from.
Yeah.
So Bob starts meeting with George Knapp, who is an investigative journalist out of Las Vegas. George Knapp, in our time, is legendary as a UFO reporter. He's heavily involved with
Okay.
Skinwalker Ranch, Bob Bigelow, all of those guys. He's done a lot of reporting on that stuff. But his kind of first big break in the UFO world was Bob Lazar.
Okay.
He grills Bob for months and eventually convinces him to go on camera with his identity blacked out under a false name.
Okay.
Bob, being a bit of a smartass, provides the pseudonym Dennis, which is the name of
Yeah,
his
sure.
boss.
Yeah.
The night that the tape airs, he says he gets a phone call from Dennis,
Yeah.
and he says, all Dennis said is, "Do you have any idea what we're going to do to you now?" And Bob says, "Well, no." And Dennis hangs up on him.
Sure.
Now, again, the timeline here is a little unclear.
Hmm.
Parts of the timeline are not unclear. Uh, he appeared on the program in May. Oh, I did get the timeline wrong. I'm sorry. Okay, there was another incident that happened first.
Okay.
Bob finds out after he sees the craft flying that that was what was called a like test flight, but they also do what are called high performance flights. And he finds out from Dennis that they know that traffic in the area is lowest on Wednesdays. So Wednesday night is when they do the high performance tests. So he knows
Okay.
this is happening. So he starts bringing friends and family out to camp on a nearby ridge and watch the
Okay.
weird lights in the sky.
Sure.
Now, Bob's claim is they're seeing traditional UFOs flying around, zipping around, doing crazy things.
Right.
Uh, they record video a couple times, although that video has never surfaced. Um, Notably, the third time, and Bob's very like sheepish when he tells the story. He's like, I got dumb. We got careless. I think we had a camper van up there the third time. We were hanging out, we're drinking beers, we're watching this stuff. He's like, and what I remember is leaning against the car, talking to a friend of mine, and we're talking about what we're seeing, and we're just bullshitting, right? And I remember saying something like, "Oh, like we got to get a bomb and go break into the base and steal one of
Whew.
these things." He's like, and the instant I said that, he's like, you got to understand, it's pitch black out here. You can't see your hand in front of your face. I see a green light on the ground in front of me. He's like, now what
Oh
happened
no.
is the security guards who have night vision cameras were right there,
Uh-huh.
maybe 30 feet away from us. And one of them dropped his night vision goggles when we said that. All of a sudden, we're surrounded by guys. They turn on their flashlights. We are detained. We're interviewed by the sheriff's department. We're eventually released.
Hmm.
We were not like arrested. The next day, they fly me up to a different airfield and interrogate and debrief me about everything that happened. Now, Bob says he was not fired, but it was clear he was not going to be allowed back in the base. So
Okay.
that was
Sure.
in April. In May, he appears on George Knapp's program. Now, when Bob talks about appearing on the program with George Knapp, he's very clear, and he was clear at the time. He was doing this because he was afraid they were going to kill him. So George Knapp was telling him,
Yeah.
"Look, if we put you on the news, they can't kill you. They'll know." So he gets
Right.
this call. "Do you know what we're going to do to you now?" And he's like, "Well, no, I don't."
Yeah.
And
How would he?
then nothing happens, kinda. Part of the
Okay.
problem is after the initial appearance on the news, George Knapp's studio starts digging into him much harder. They had already done some research, and they find out they can't find his birth certificate. They can't find his
Hmm.
educational records. They can't verify where he worked. They call up Los Alamos Labs. They're like, "We've never had a Bob Lazar here." They call up MIT and Caltech. They're like, "We never had a student named Bob Lazar." Like, everything is just gone. There are no records of Bob's employment anywhere. Now, what Bob and George Knapp claim is the government erased his records to discredit him. What skeptics say is Bob lied about his educational credentials. What else is he going to lie
Sure,
about?
right.
Now, there's no way to prove this. Bob's memory is not great. Bob is the
Yeah.
classic absent-minded scientist. He's like, yes, I went to MIT. They're like, what professors did you have? He's like,
Oh, no.
right? Like, do you remember the
Yeah.
names of any of your college professors? He's like, I had
No.
this professor. They go look that guy up. There's never been a teacher by that name at MIT. But there was a science teacher by that name at Bob's high school.
Ah, interesting.
uh,
Yeah. So that, I mean,
they
that's
can't find
something.
any record of him going to Caltech, but they do find record of him going to Pierce Community College. You know, like so
Hmm.
the story that starts coming out about Bob doesn't look great for Bob. It makes him look like someone who, at best, lied about his educational record.
Sure.
But here's the thing. This is a story I hear everybody say when they want to debunk Bob. They're like, he lied about his educational credentials. You can't trust anything he says.
Hmm.
I don't know about you, Chuck. You and I both are the kind of late Gen X, early millennial generation where we
Mhm.
came of age as the
I think
internet was
elder
becoming.
millennial is the
Yeah,
term.
right. Um, and I remember the awkward tension of how you applied for jobs as the internet
Hmm.
started becoming a thing
Yeah.
got a little more awkward because before
Yeah.
you would put your educational credentials on your resume and no one would check them because there wasn't really a good way to check it. You're not going to call the
Yeah.
admissions department every time you have someone apply. But now
Yeah.
that
I'm
stuff's a
still not
lot
sure they
easier to
check.
check. Right. So people talk about the idea of Bob lying about his academic history as if this is a real damning thing. I don't
But this
think
is
it is.
pre-internet. Yeah.
The impression I get of Bob is your classic severe ADHD science guy who just cannot be bothered by anything that isn't science. He did
Yeah.
not do well in high school. We have his
Sure.
transcripts from high school. But I know a lot of sciencey guys who did terribly in everything except their science
Yeah.
classes. They barely
Yep.
graduated, right? Like, um,
Yeah. That's me.
Bob claims the reason there's no records of him being at MIT is because he was asked to take the classes under a pseudonym by the military.
Hmm.
Uh,
Interesting.
all right, maybe, I guess.
Maybe.
I find it believable that he forgot the names of his professors. I also find it completely believable but that Bob lied about having a BS or an MA
Yeah.
and applying for a job at Los Alamos and
Totally.
getting in because nobody really checked it.
And nobody cares. If you're
Now,
a great scientist, like, who cares? Right?
right. Now, here's where we get into the weird territory of was Bob's past erased or is he lying?
Does it
So, okay,
matter?
there are no records. He went to school with people, right? He worked
Sure.
with people. And this is where we definitely get into one of those things, like we talked about with the Admiral Wilson memo. I think there are just as many points that make this believable as there are points that make it unbelievable. Bob
Okay.
says he worked at Los Alamos. Nobody can prove it. Nobody can find any records. Well, somebody found a phone book from Los Alamos in the
Hmm.
80s that does list Bob Lazar. So we know he
Okay.
was working at Los Alamos.
Okay.
The skeptics come out and say there's a difference between working at Los Alamos and working for Los Alamos. Los Alamos
Hmm.
employs a lot of contractors. They
Sure.
think Bob was a contractor for this one group that hired out technicians. They say Bob was actually just the technician that checked everyone's radiation badges. He would have been listed in the directory if that was his job. Bob says that isn't the case. Um, he says he worked at S4. He told George Knapp, when you apply to work at a secure government facility, you work with a guy who does your background check. The guy who did my background check was this guy named Mike Thigpen. Uh, George Knapp was never
Clearly
able
a
to find
fake
this
name.
guy, but Jeremy Corbell, who did the recent documentary on Bob Lazar, was able to find him,
Hmm.
interviewed him a couple times, couldn't get him on camera, but he admitted that yes, he was like dodging George Knapp's calls. And Jeremy was able to find a handwritten note that Mike Thigpen had left at one of Bob's associates. One of the things that they do when they're doing a background check is they go meet all your friends and family. So
Yep.
Mike Thigpen went to someone that Bob Lazar knew, said,
Yep.
I'm here to talk about Bob. Give me a call. My name is Mike Thigpen. Okay, so there are all these parts that like line up and then other parts that don't. The main thing I want to say is I think the main thing people pull out against Bob, and there's a couple other things I'll bring up in a minute, is they say he lied about his educational background. Now, first of all, I don't think that's proven. I think that is one interpretation of the fact that there are no records. An equally likely interpretation is that his records were removed. We do hear about that kind of shit happening.
Sure.
But even if he was lying about his past, I don't think that proves that he's not who he is and didn't do what he said he did. I think it was way more common than people want to admit in the 70s and 80s to straight up lie about your credentials.
Totally.
If Bob is a
Totally.
guy with a middling high school record who knows he's smart enough and cares deeply about it, I find it completely plausible that he lied about who
Yeah.
he was and got jobs at Los Alamos and yada yada.
Yeah.
It
I
also
totally buy
fits
that.
with the story he tells about meeting the father of the hydrogen bomb, getting a reference from him. Like, hey,
Yep.
that's me in the paper where it describes me as a physicist at Los Alamos National
Uh-huh.
Labs. He doesn't need to know that I'm only checking radiation badges. What he knows is I'm the
Right?
jet car guy who's a physicist at Los Alamos
At
Labs.
Los Alamos. Yeah. And now
Right.
you've got
Yeah,
a
exactly.
solid recommendation from someone who clearly, like, yeah, that's going to get you
Exactly.
in. That's going to at least open
Totally.
doors, right?
Yeah. And a lot of people are like, why would the government hire someone as weird and sketchy as Bob Lazar? Well, they weren't hiring
Mm,
him for an over the board project. They were hiring
yeah,
him
right.
for an extremely compartmentalized program where they had a recent vacancy. Hey, this
Due
jet
to
car guy
industrial
showed up
accident. Yeah.
recommended by Edward Teller. Like,
Like, oh, you're clearly an idiot enough to take this job. All right.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the way Bob talks about this stuff is really funny. Like, he describes the moment that he couldn't touch the antimatter device because of the gravity waves it
Yeah.
was generating. That was the moment that he realized, oh shit, everything that was in that briefing doc was true. And they asked him, what do you mean by that? He's like, they read your briefing docs? He's like, yeah, the briefing doc said all kinds of crazy shit. It said, like, this is a crashed craft from Zeta Reticuli 3, and, like, they're, like, there's a weapon engineering program and a force field program and this and that. And he's like, I didn't know what to believe. He's like, I remember thinking, is this a test? Are they going to come
Mm,
in and, like,
sure.
grill me about this and see how much of the weird stuff in here I can remember? He said it's also not uncommon for these compartmentalized programs to put disinformation in your
Yeah,
briefing packet.
absolutely.
A, to discredit you if you come out with it, but B, you put different disinfo in each person's pack.
That's the
So if
one.
something leaks, you
Yep.
know who leaked it. So
Yeah. I
he's
was
like,
wondering if,
yeah, he's
yeah,
being
I
very
was
clear.
wondering
He's
about
like, I
Dennis's
don't know
name.
where these, yeah,
Like,
he's like, I don't
yo,
know
you
where
used
these craft
Dennis's
come
name.
from.
Now we know who you are.
Right. Yeah. So Bob's being very clear. He's like, I don't know where these craft came from. The briefing
Yeah.
doc said X.
Yeah.
He's like, what I actually thought the first time I walked past it, it had a US flag sticker on it. I remember thinking, like, oh, this explains all the UFO conspiracy stuff. It's actually just a high-tech US prototype. Like, it all
Mm-hmm.
slotted into his worldview. So Bob is kind of weirdly not credulous, but like he is not coming out here and telling you what it is. He's telling you what he saw and not putting any credit to it. He's like, this is what I read in a briefing doc. He will stake his claim on the science of what he saw. And that's another interesting thing because I think most scientists that I know are like this, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. I'm not super interested in it, but let me tell you about the weird gravity emitter
Yeah.
I saw. I remember every detail of that fucking thing, right? Like,
Hmm.
yeah, there
Yeah.
were guards. Sure. Yeah, they interviewed me.
Yeah.
He tells George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell about a weird biometric security device they had that would measure the bones in your hands. This was something that everybody gave him a lot of grief for. And then in the recent Jeremy Corbell document, he found this device. And it's this weird thing with these like this spot you put your hand down and your fingers push it out, and then a light shines up from below and it can measure your bones. Um, this was an actual early biometric security device. He says the
Interesting.
thing that makes this really compelling is not that Bob knew about it, but that it wasn't a very good device. It was only in use for a few years at military
Yeah,
facilities in the US, and it was during the window when Bob claims to have worked at S4. This would have
interesting.
been the cutting edge tech at the time. And they would have rotated out like 2 years later. He's like, I met
Right.
a tech who worked on installing these things at military bases. He hated them. He's like, they
Yeah.
broke down all the time. It's like, so it's one of those things that went from being something to discredit Bob to being something that credits Bob, because how else would he
Yeah.
know about this weird, wonky blip in time security device? Um,
Right.
okay, so there's a couple other things about Bob that people don't like, and these are also things that I think they show that Bob has bad judgment, but
Hmm.
don't show that he's a liar.
Yeah, that
uh,
that all checks out with the ADHD.
yeah, Bob declared bankruptcy in 1986. This is before he
Totally
started
cool.
working at S4.
Yeah.
This is after the death of his first wife.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
claims
Can be
in
rough.
his bankruptcy filing don't match what he said later. His
Hmm.
he claims in the
Okay.
bankruptcy filing that he was a self-employed photo processing guy. He doesn't mention being
Uh-huh.
a physicist. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, I could see
fine.
that. Like,
Like
you're gonna
if
you're
Bob's the
gonna do
kind of
some
guy who lies,
shenanigans.
yeah, and if Bob's the kind of guy who lies about his educational background, does Bob strike you as the kind of guy who cares what the IRS thinks about him?
No,
Right? Like,
not at all.
yeah, he's trying to get out of a bankruptcy. Um,
Yeah.
he was arrested in 1990, so post S4, uh,
Okay.
for running an illegal brothel.
Shit.
It's
Okay,
worth noting there are
that's a little
legal
rough.
brothels in Nevada, so it's not quite as absurd as
So
it sounds.
like you
He
have to
ends up
like
taking,
actually work to do that, don't you? Like,
yeah. Now he took a plea bargain to a lesser charge. Bob claims all he did was set up a computer for this woman who was running the brothel. He didn't
ah,
know anything about it and wasn't really involved. All
okay.
the evidence shows Bob was a co-owner, took part of the profits, installed security cameras, like he was all in. George
Yeah.
Knapp describes Bob as kind of a rebel. He's into guns and hookers. For a number of years,
Okay. I
Bob
mean,
ran an
yeah.
event out in the desert called like the Desert Blast, where he and a bunch of other enthusiasts would show up and light off homemade fireworks and explosives. So
God,
we
this
get this
all
picture
checks
of
out.
Bob as a scientist who's really into goofy shit, doesn't particularly care about rules,
Yeah.
makes bad judgments,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. Yep.
I get it. I
It
get why that
all
doesn't
makes
make
sense.
him the most credible witness. But to my mind, it doesn't discredit him. It just shows that he has bad judgment, which I think fits with this kind of absent-minded scientist thing.
Yeah, right.
Uh, he now runs a scientific supply company that has been raided by the feds twice.
Okay.
Once for selling illegal fireworks supplies across state lines, and
Yeah, all
once
right.
as part of a murder investigation, which to his credit, they were
Hmm.
very clear he is not a suspect for. They were looking to see whether a murderer somewhere else had bought something that could be used
Ah,
to poison someone from him.
okay.
Uh,
Sure. Sure, makes sense.
however, leaning into the conspiracy theory side, the timing of that second raid was real curious. It
Hmm.
happened hours after Bob Lazar and Jeremy Corbell, the filmmaker, had a private conversation in the woods on Bob's property where Bob strongly implied that he still possesses a sample of element 115 that he smuggled out of S4. Hours
Interesting.
later, 25 forensic experts show up to his little
Yeah.
like two-person business
Yeah.
and go over his computers with a fine-tooth comb, and they quote back parts of the conversation that he had with Jeremy to
Oh,
him.
okay.
Now, again, this all comes back to how credible is Bob Lazar? Did they actually
Yeah.
quote that back to him? Were there actually 25, for instance? We
Yeah.
know there
Right.
was a raid. There is a stated reason for a raid. There was a warrant. Were they using that as an excuse? Who knows, right?
Hmm.
But anyway, all that to say, I get it. I get why Bob Lazar is not the most credible guy. I want to wrap up here with there are a couple of things that I find compelling about Bob. Okay. He was
Okay.
right about S4 existing. He was
Okay.
right about element 115 existing. He was right
Well,
about gravity waves existing.
sure.
If he did lie about his education, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything else he
Yeah.
says is
That's
false. It
fine.
just shows he has bad judgment. He is listed in the phone book for Los Alamos National Laboratory, and in the bankruptcy court, he produced a W-2 from the Department of Naval Intelligence. So there are some records that he worked in the places that he says he worked. Um, Later things that have come out have verified parts of the story in weird ways. EG&G being part of the whole UFO business. Uh, they found Mike Thigpen, the agent who did background checks. The Admiral
Hmm.
Wilson document, which we talked about, which is controversial in
Yeah.
its own rights,
Right.
describes the programs working just the way Bob says, extremely
Right.
compartmentalized, extremely high security. You bring scientists in for a few years, see if materials
Yeah.
science has made any advance. If you haven't, you spin it down again. In that
But
world, it's a little
Admiral
more
Wilson,
credible that,
that was all produced after
yeah,
Lazar had like gone public, so could
that's
be.
true. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, he knew about the weird hand scanner device.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
all of this is circumstantial. I will 100% grant you. But to put some evidence on the backside of it, I will say two other things. One, we know that the Pentagon has used disinformation
Sure.
people to ruin people's lives before. The
Hmm.
most notable example is one you and I haven't talked about before, but there's a guy named Richard Doty who worked for the government, and he is very weirdly proud of the work that he's come forward as a whistleblower, but he doesn't seem contrite at all. He talks about
Hmm.
misleading journalists. He talks about doing things to ruin people's reputations. Notably, one guy who was seeing weird lights over an airfield, he befriended him and kept spinning stories to him even after he found out the guy was mentally unstable, and he ended up killing himself. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, the military is not above ruining
Yep.
someone who might spoil secrets. So, like,
Yeah.
yes, that is a conspiracy theory, but it's also a conspiracy theory. We have evidence things like that have happened before.
Sure.
And the thing I find most compelling about Robert Lazar, he very, very clearly regrets ever coming forward. He is miserable every time he is in an interview. I'm not saying he's never turned a profit on it. He has sold some books, he has sold his rights to a movie company, but he tries to be clear about not making a lot of money on it, and he is clearly reluctant to speak. Every time he does speak, he says he gets weirdos camping out on his yard, people who, like, oh my God, no one believed me, but you'll believe me, Bob. And like he has to call the cops and get them involved. He very clearly just wants to be left alone to make his weird
Yeah.
illegal fireworks and hang out with hookers. And he's gotten sucked into this weird story, and nobody believes him, and he's miserable
Yeah.
about it. And in his Joe Rogan interview a couple of years ago, Joe asked him, he's like, "Do you regret coming forward?" Bob's like, "God, yes." He's like,
Hmm.
"There's not a night that goes by that I don't lie in bed kicking myself because I could be there right now."
Hmm.
He's like, "That's the only part I care about was the science." He's like,
Yeah.
I don't care
Now
whether
he
it's
can't do
alien. I
science.
don't care. He's like, it's the worst thing because now I know that's out there and I
Yeah.
can't access it. I had access. I was there
Yeah.
and I did dumb shit. I brought friends out to the range and got
Hmm.
arrested. I like,
Yeah.
I made dumb mistakes. I was in my early 20s. I was dumb. He's very, very clear about this. He's not trying to play it up like he's some hero. He's like, I was painted into a corner and worried they would kill me. I was pressured into doing the interview. I He's like, yes, I regret it. I regret it every day. I find that very compelling. There are a lot of people out there who are saying all sorts of crazy things and very clearly see themselves as the hero in the story.
Right,
I
yeah,
am risking it all to bring you this information. That ain't Bob. Bob's like, I don't know, man. I was there. I wish I was still there, but I guess if I'm not,
yeah,
sure. Yeah, I'll talk to you. It's a crime. They're not telling people, whatever.
yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I see some compelling stuff there. Like S4 and 115 don't feel that compelling to me. Gravity waves, I just looked at, we actually
Mhm.
had clear detections in 1974. So like that was well known. We didn't have great detections of it, but until recently.
Mhm.
Lying, yeah, I don't care about that. And the hand scanner device I think is fascinating, but I don't, but it doesn't say like what he was doing there. Like he could
Mhm.
have been
Yeah, agreed.
contractor again, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and from the background, it sort of feels like maybe uh, you know, who makes a jet car except someone who wants to be more important than they are.
Could
Um,
be. Yeah.
and so like I can imagine him being like a smart cookie janitor um,
Mhm.
who maybe didn't have access to the whole program, or maybe he did see
Yeah.
things. I don't know. Um, or maybe it's all true, and wouldn't that be cool?
No,
Uh,
I
yeah, I don't
think
know.
you hit the nail on the head, right? And there are aspects of this that I bring to you that I feel pretty strongly about, right? Like you and I joke about the phrasing of the government has admitted UFOs are real. I feel pretty
Yeah,
strongly about that, right?
yeah,
And you and I have debated about that before. Bob Lazar is one of the ones I will give you. I don't blame anybody who finds the Bob Lazar story completely improbable.
yeah,
Totally granted, there's a lot here that gives you reason, that'll give you pause. Absolutely, I get it.
yeah.
The reason I like talking about it is, like some of the best stuff we've talked about, it's like everything else, right? If it's true, and I'm not saying it is,
Whew.
but if it is, whew, it's a very exciting time, Chuck,
Yeah,
because at the end of the day,
because that'd be
what Bob
cool.
Lazar is doing, if he is to be believed, he is a
Yeah,
whistleblower of a secret government reverse engineering project.
yeah,
And he's saying some wild things, right? Let's
yeah,
leave aside the issue of the archaeological recovery
yeah.
because
Right. Yeah,
that thing alone is worth a discussion.
right.
Just the fact that there are 9 different craft, that paints a whole story.
That's
So if
huge.
we
Yeah,
accept this story, where are they from? Why are they all different?
yeah.
Does that mean there are
Are they the
nine
same?
different
Yeah,
origins? Like,
yeah.
yeah,
Or
I
just nine
am
different models?
absolutely fascinated. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right? It's like Chevy, Ford, Subaru.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know, man. So I find the whole thing extremely, extremely fascinating. And the thing I will say
Yeah.
about Bob Lazar is he came out in '88 and he has been just as hotly debated every year since. There has never been
Yeah.
any conclusive one way or the other. There's plenty of
Yeah.
people who would like to think Bob Lazar is settled and done. He is completely unbelievable. And there's equal number of people who think Bob Lazar is settled and done. We've proven he is who he says he is. Obviously, we have not proven in either direction, or he
Yeah.
would not still be hotly debated,
Right.
almost 40 years later. But yeah,
Yeah.
Bob Lazar, fascinating story.
Yeah. Super cool. After the podcast, remind me to tell you the story of trying to get a security clearance and flunking out. It's not relevant to
Oh,
this, but it is a funny story. So,
all right. Well, that about wraps it up for today. Next time, hopefully, we will be talking about the
yeah,
UAP report.
hopefully.
I don't
That'd
actually
be
know,
awesome.
so we'll see what happens there.
Yeah.
Chuck, any parting thoughts here? Any last things you want to say?
No, this is a great story. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for listening. Okay, thank you for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. Chuck, as always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs so she doesn't have to.